Start. And good evening, everyone. Welcome again to the latest of our Selwyn webinars. And tonight we're delighted to be joined by Sir Stephen Wall, alumnus and honorary fellow, who's going to be talking about the EU. But as usual, before we do get underway, a quick update from me about what's going on here at Selwyn. We do tonight, by the way, have again over 600 people joining us, and they are current students in association with the Selwyn College Politics Society, their alumni and friends from Britain and from around the world. So you're all very welcome. And it's kind of interesting that it's not just showbiz and entertainment that get the crowds out, it's also Brexit. So we will be discussing that in just a moment. Now, as I say, the usual update, and it's getting near the end of term, and many undergraduates will be leaving us at the end of this week, though actually more people than usual staying over the Christmas vacation for the obvious reasons of travel being difficult and so on. I think probably worth saying that this term, which has had its ups and downs, has generally been successful, and we've kept in-person teaching going as best we can, along with online lectures. And really the big boon, I think, has been the Cambridge University testing programme on coronavirus, which has given us the key data we need every week through the term. And as a kind of reassurance to everyone, the last week of asymptomatic testing, when people were tested last Thursday, with results on Friday, we had 0 cases of coronavirus discovered through the asymptomatic programme at Selwyn. And having had a peak of some dozens of people self-isolating at one point in the term, as of last Friday, we were down to fewer than 10. And it has been tough for the students involved, but it does mean that we have provided a largely COVID-free and safe environment for most of the term for most of the students. And we would like to thank the students who have been incredibly responsible and cooperative all through the term. Now, we will be providing, for those who are staying, plenty of support through the Christmas holiday. We're very grateful indeed to Gavin Boyle, one of our alumni, who's been providing half-price turkey meals in the last few days, and those will continue this week. And we will also be here on Christmas morning. So Christmas morning we'll be providing, as I always do actually, drinks for the undergraduates who are here, and the graduate students too, and that we expect to be a rather larger contingent than in normal years. And for Lent term, the shape of it we expect to be largely the same as Michaelmas term, though obviously we're hoping that it's on a journey to greater normality, and the year as the vaccine takes hold, we hope in 2021, will become rather more recognisable in a way that all our alumni and friends would want us to be. And just to say that we will discuss at Council tomorrow whether we keep the marquee on the lawn, and it's certainly the recommendation of the development director and of myself that we do, because we're very keen to get people back here next year. So the marquee would be one of the ways in which we'd be able to get greater numbers of people back, and we are very keen to see you as soon as we possibly can. So that's the update. We'll move now to the subject of Europe and to Stephen Wall. As I say, not just an alumnus, but an honorary fellow, and 35 years experience as a diplomat, including being UK permanent representative to the EU and a really key advisor to John Major and to Tony Blair. He has a new book out called Reluctant European, which I can heartily recommend. It's a very, very good read. And the subtitle is Britain and the EU from 1945 to Brexit. So with Stephen, we'll be doing the usual format of 20 minutes or so of me having a chat with Stephen, and then your questions and answers. And please do send them in via the chat function on Zoom. So Stephen, good evening to you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be back at Selwyn, albeit virtually.
Now, we'll come to the history in a moment, which is the essence of your book. But obviously, the end game is underway in the Brexit negotiations in London. Have you any clue what's going on now between Britain and the EU?
Well, only what I read in the newspaper, which, or quotes from Dominic Raab today, suggesting that it's all coming down to fish, which is not altogether surprising. before we actually joined the European Union, we and the Danes and the Irish and the Norwegians at the time wanted to discuss with the then 6 members of the EEC what a fisheries policy might look like. And they said, well, actually, more or less what they said was, actually, given that you've got most of the fish, we're going to determine the policy. And if you want to join, you've got to sign up to it. So it's not surprising that now that we're leaving, we're saying we want to get most of our access to our fish stocks back, and our partners are saying, well, hang on a minute, there is a policy in place. And even beyond that policy, there are countries like France, for example, that have historic fishing rights that long predate membership of the European Community or European Union. So it's going to be, it's one of those issues which in economic terms is not that significant, but in political terms for all countries, including of course our own, not least because of Scotland, is very neuralgic. So I don't myself think there's any reason why there shouldn't be a deal, but you never know with these negotiations, and it's not really possible to say. I would expect there to be a deal, but let's see.
Okay, let's look at the history. And the history, your book starts really from 1945. And it's fair to say, isn't it, that Britain was slow to realise what was happening in Europe and the desire for some sort of European unity after the Second World War. So we didn't really quite see what was going on.
No, we didn't. I mean, of course, we'd emerged from World War II with our institutions, as it were, vindicated, validated. Other countries had had theirs destroyed. For us, the physical frontier, the sea, basically, was important. For them, the physical frontier had been totally hopeless, of course. It had been entirely porous. So they wanted a kind of political frontier. And Jean Monnet and others had the genius to come up with what was, first of all, the coal and steel community, and then the European community, that provided that political framework, shared sovereignty, shared interests via economics. And we didn't see its significance, partly because most of our trade was with the countries of the Commonwealth. Australia, a country of 10 million people at the time, remained our biggest overseas market until the mid-1950s. And we didn't see the political significance of it. And insofar as we did, then the idea of sharing sovereignty was anathema to first of all, the Labour government and then its conservative successors in the early 50s.
And when we finally decide that something is going on of interest, and as you say, British exceptionalism wasn't necessarily completely incomprehensible because of being an island nation and because of the Commonwealth. But in the 50s, we then start thinking that the European community might be something we want to join, and we start an application process that culminates in the early 60s with, of course, a French veto. So de Gaulle vetoes the idea of Britain joining at the point we decide we do want to join.
Yeah, partly I think, and there's a lot of obviously history with de Gaulle and the Anglo-Saxons. Christopher Soames, son-in-law of Winston Churchill, was the British Agriculture Minister at the time, and the French Agriculture Minister said to him about a week before de Gaulle's veto, at the moment there is a dunghill with 1 cockerel on it. If you join, there'll be a dunghill with 2 cockerels on it. 1 dunghill, 1 cockerel is fun. 1 dunghill, 2 cockerels, not so much. So that was a factor. But de Gaulle also saw that we would radically change the nature of the European Union, and also that if we came in, many others, not just as it happened, the Irish and Danes who joined with us, but many others would join. I mean, the interesting thing about the application that Macmillan made, and then it was renewed by the Wilson government, also then vetoed by de Gaulle, was that their main reason for doing so was political. I mean, our government now talk about global Britain. I mean, Macmillan's argument to the British people in a pamphlet was, look, there are 2 superpowers. We're not one of the superpowers. China rising fast. If we're going to have global political influence, we need to be alongside like-minded democratic countries. And that was also the main argument that the Labour government used when they applied to join. So it's rather curious that having come to that conclusion and spent 40 years exercising our global influence via the European Union, we should decide on one day in June 2016 that actually that was a mistake, and somehow we can exercise global influence on our own. But there we are.
Now, your book is scrupulously fair. We should say that you were the lead speaker on the Remain side in the debate we had in Selwyn Chapel in 2016 at the time of the referendum. But one of the ways in which the book is, I think, very fair is you point out that when we do finally join in 1973 under the Heath government, that the terms on which we join are actually rather bad. And that seems to me to shape that early membership, because it wasn't as if we were joining at that point on wonderful terms.
It does. I mean, I've always argued that if we were all nice people, we wouldn't need the European Union. And I mean, you know, the French under President Pompidou agreed to open the door, but only on condition that the financing arrangements for the European community were definitively fixed before we joined, and they were fixed in a way that was very disadvantageous to us. So first of all, the Labour government that came in 1970, and then after them, the Thatcher government came in 79. Both those governments effectively renegotiated the terms of our membership, the financial terms in particular. I mean, I think what the situation for the UK was that in per capita terms, we were one of the poorest countries in the European community when we joined. And yet, alongside Germany, a very wealthy country, we were the only one that paid more into the budget than we got back. I think if we'd had 10 years in which the British government could say to the British people, look, here's the money we are getting from the European community, in the way that the Spanish, the Greek, Portuguese governments have been able to do, I think maybe our attitude to the European community, European Union, would have been quite different.
And having joined on those bad terms, there's then the first referendum in 1975. You say in the book that a number of things were omitted from the British government pamphlet at the time. So it said nothing, you say, about the fact that once laws had been made at EEC level, Parliament at Westminster could not change them. And it also says in the pamphlet that no important new policy can be decided in Brussels or anywhere else without the consent of a British minister answerable to a British government and the British Parliament, which wasn't true, was it?
Well, it was thought to be true. I mean, I won't go into the excruciating detail, but there was a political arrangement whereby, even when majority voting applied, if one country said, look, there's a very important national interest here for us, then discussion should continue until agreement was reached. But it was always a political agreement rather than a legally binding one. But President Pompidou, in particular, in negotiating with Ted Heath, made it a condition of our membership that we signed up to this arrangement. So we thought it was more set in concrete than it was. So that was an honest mistake, if you like, by British ministers. But we certainly underestimate, I mean, the European Union is designed to be a dynamic process. I mean, self-evidently, if you reach legally binding agreements at European level, they can't then be contradicted by separate arrangements at national level. I think I'm right in saying that it's the only treaty that has that built-in dynamism. Each time you make an agreement, okay, you may argue, as I would argue, that your sovereignty is enhanced by your extra influence and what you can do collectively, but in parliamentary terms, your sovereignty is diminished because the role of Parliament is diminished. And that was always a bigger issue for us than for any other country, I think, because we saw our national identity as being kind of linked with parliamentary sovereignty in a way that wasn't the same for most of our partners. I mean, when I was in Brussels in the 1990s, and we were arguing about majority voting on tax issues, which we were vehemently opposed, I used to say to my colleagues from other EU member states that, don't forget, you know, we cut the head off the king in England to assert Parliament's powers over taxation. We're not going to give them up now for the sake of the European Union.
Let's talk a bit about, we're beating through the history, but let's talk a bit about Margaret Thatcher. Because Margaret Thatcher spends the first part of her time as Prime Minister fighting on the budget and generally making herself very unpopular. However, she also has in her time what was arguably the greatest British triumph in the European community, or European Union as it was becoming, which was the creation of the single market. So just give us a bit of context on Thatcher.
Well, I think she is, I mean, she is paradoxical. I mean, I think there was a lot about the European community that she hated. First of all, I mean, it was all men, and she regarded, you know, men as pretty useless. The fact is that, in particular, President Giscard d'Estaing of France, when she became Prime Minister, treated her very badly in a very sort of patronizing way, which didn't help. But her basic view was that the European community was a very important factor for peace in Europe, no more war, and also for advancing prosperity. And the commitment to a single market had been there on the face of the treaties since 1957, and very little had been done about it. And she basically forced it onto the agenda. And in so doing, I mean, again, paradoxically, in the treaty that gave rise to the Single European Act, accepted a bigger increase in the number of treaty articles subject to majority voting than at any other time. That's a considerable achievement. And she also has a big achievement, I think, in advancing the agenda of enlargement at a time when countries of Eastern and Central Europe was still under the Soviet kosh. I mean, in her Bruges speech in '88, she said, "Let us not forget that Warsaw, Prague, and Budapest are great European cities." At the time, that was regarded as like spitting in church. And I mean, later on, when I worked for John Major, I remember President Mitterrand saying to John Major, "Look, do you think these countries are going to join by 2000?" And John Major said, "No, probably not." 2004, John Major said, "Yeah, maybe." And Mitterrand says, "No, I can tell you, we're not going to have them in before 2010. Well, they did in fact join in 2004. So Britain was in the vanguard, supported by Germany in that, and we were suspected of doing it because we wanted to dilute the whole thing. Well, that wasn't the motive. The motive was, and John Major, I felt this very passionately, you cannot say to countries that have been for 50 years under the yoke of tyranny, you cannot now join this club because it's a rich man's club. And whatever problems we've got now with Hungary and Poland, I passionately believe that was the right decision.
Obviously, the time we're coming up to now is a time when you were working, as you say, for John Major and for Tony Blair. But let me try and pick out some themes. I mean, one of the themes, it seems in your book, is that when it really comes to it, at all the very big moments, ultimately the French and the Germans stick together. And it's usually Britain on the outside. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, by the time we joined, they had formed the habit of cooperation. I mean, the Franco-German reconciliation treaty between de Gaulle and Adenauer was signed just about the same time as de Gaulle's veto, probably not by accident. And the French and Germans set up a whole mechanism of cooperation, regular meetings between ministers and officials, etc., and made real sacrifices to each other to make it work. We always found that very, very difficult. I mean, there was a brief attempt after the Iraq War to create a kind of trilateral relationship, but it didn't work, partly because I and my colleague Nigel Scheinwald from Number 10 would go off to the Elysee to find that the French and Germans had been sort of concocting their joint line before we arrived, but partly because British ministers simply wouldn't make the compromises necessary to make it work. And by that stage, post-Iraq, Tony Blair didn't really have the authority anymore to kind of force those compromises through cabinet.
And if the French and Germans tended to ally at the key moments, it's also the case, as you set out in the book, that when Tony Blair had that monumental choice about Iraq, he went with the United States rather than with France and Germany.
Yeah, and I think that's, to me, that's a matter of regret, because I think that President Chirac was right. I think that war should be the last resort, and this wasn't the last resort so long as the inspection process was continuing. And as we know, in the end, the nuclear weapons weren't there. And I think it would have been perfectly possible for Tony Blair to help construct a European policy, which would have been tough on Saddam Hussein, but short of war, and take that to the United States. Instead, the so-called bridge between Europe and the United States worked only one way, and it was going from west to east, not east to west.
I suppose the other theme I pick out, as well as the Franco-German alliance, is that you are really disappointed with the pro-EU politicians, the people who are supposed to be pro-European. And apart from Ted Heath, nobody really quite delivers on it, including Tony Blair. And I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I sense a bit of a sort of general disappointment with Tony Blair on Europe.
Well, I think he did have the opportunity, insofar as he had an overwhelming majority and at that stage, no residual hostility to the European Union within the Labour Party, to do more. I think what bedeviled it, as far as Tony Blair was concerned, was that Gordon Brown was, to a greater extent than I realized at the time, but as we now know, absolutely obsessed by believing that he should be Prime Minister rather than Tony Blair. And Gordon Brown latched on to what he would regard as a sort of robust pro-Britishness, but translated into actually going to Brussels and beating up our partners as a way of advancing his cause. And so while Tony Blair was encouraging other ministers to speak out about Europe, they didn't dare do so, because if they put their head above the parapet, they risked getting it chopped off by Gordon Brown. And I think that bedeviled the attempts that Tony Blair did make to present the positive case.
There's a very telling section in your book when you talk about the coalition agreement in 2010, and that was a Conservative government elected on a platform of staying in the EU and being members of the European Union, and of course aligning with the Liberal Democrats, who were supposedly the most liberal pro-European party in British politics. And you make the point that in the coalition agreement that they came up with, they had 11 points about the EU, and 10 of them were negative. So the first one, no further transfer of sovereignty of powers during the course of this parliament. A referendum if there's going to be any further increase of competence. The 1972 European Communities Act would be amended so the use would require, it goes on and on, all the things which allegedly two pro-European parties want to stop Europe going any further.
Yeah, but I think the Lib Dems by then were beginning, especially in the West Country, where of course they had seats, were beginning to come up against anti-European sentiment. That affected their attitude, and they were committed to a referendum in certain circumstances themselves. So I think that was a big factor. I mean, one of the ironies is that the agreement that David Cameron eventually secured from the EU, and which would have come into effect had the result of the Brexit referendum been Remain, that agreement so diluted the terms of our membership that I think we'd have been left wondering, what actually is left. I mean, when as a country you can no longer sign up to the goal of ever closer union among the peoples of Europe, which is the very first commitment of the Treaty of Rome. How much in practice is there left?
And that you bring out very clearly, which is the goal of an ever closer union. Britain has never really wanted to do, and that's not just the politicians, but of course the population appear not to want it either. So that is the fault line, isn't it?
I think it is the fault line, and that's why I thought during the referendum campaign that in the end, we'd probably stick to nurse for fear of something worse. But I was never confident, because if you look at opinion polls throughout our membership, apart from two periods, one the '75 referendum, and two in when the Single European Act and the Single Market came in. Apart from that, the opinion polls had always hovered around 50% in Britain. I marginally in favour of staying or marginally in favour of leaving. There was never ever the level of support that you found in other EU countries.
And when the referendum happens in 2016, as I say, we saw you came here and delivered a very powerful case for staying in the EU. What was your own feeling the morning after the referendum?
Well, I'd gone to bed thinking that it was won, because there was an opinion poll which people thought was an exit poll, but actually wasn't an exit poll, which suggested that. I mean, I was obviously, for me it was a matter of deep dismay. And still is. I think we have made a huge mistake in terms of our national interest. But I think what I had completely failed to grasp, it did strike me campaigning, how impervious people seemed to be to kind of factual and logical argument. And I think I'd completely failed to see the extent to which identity politics was really at play here. And perhaps it was the first really cogent example of identity politics at work. And we know there are all kinds of reasons for that. But that was very difficult to counter, I think, in practice by argument about what would actually happen if we were outside the single market, etc., etc.
There is a rather brilliant quote you pick out in the book again, which is from Gordon Brown speaking at the Edinburgh International Book Festival in 2019, in which he blames David Cameron for losing their referendum, saying, quote, "They didn't put a positive case for Europe, and that's why we're in this position," said Gordon Brown. And there are some rich ironies here, aren't there?
Yes, there are. I used to people. When I was in Brussels, my colleagues from other member states used to say to me, how do you get on with your finance minister, with Gordon Brown? And I said, I get on very well. I said, he comes every month, and I sit next to him at the meetings. And if I say, "Good morning, Chancellor," about 1 week in 7, 1 month in 7, he might actually reply to my greeting of good morning. He basically came, usually with some entirely kind of bogus row, which he had kind of dreamed up for the Sunday papers, usually making an issue about something that was pretty much settled in advance, in order to be able to appeal to the Sun and the Daily Mail. And of course, Tony Blair had done a deal with Murdoch before the '79 election, which of itself, to an extent, tied the hands of the Labour government behind their back in terms of their attitude to Europe, because Tony Blair could not afford to alienate the Murdoch press.
Yeah, though he was sitting on a majority of, one of the biggest majorities in British parliamentary history, which is, an interesting counter argument. Stephen, we'll get the questions are coming in. So in 2 or 3 minutes, we'll start taking the questions. But let me ask you before that, really the very end of the book, where you talk about what happens next for Britain, what happens next for the EU. So first, tell us how you see after we've left and the transition agreement is over, what does then happen?
I think that geography is destiny, so we can't escape the fact that we are European, and we can't escape the fact that our most important trading partners are going to continue to be the members of the EU, and they are our neighbours who, by and large, share the same democratic values as we do. So we have to reforge a close relationship with them, and that does partly depend on making them trust us and not feel the sense of betrayal that they feel at the moment. As far as global Britain is concerned, I mean, I think we do have some continuing assets: our permanent membership of the United Nations, our role in NATO. The Foreign Affairs Committee of the House of Commons commissioned some interesting research, which does actually show that the democratic values that we espouse, the role of the BBC, the role of the British Council, the role of our leading universities and so on, those do count for things, and people still see us as a force for democracy, and they valued our role in development, which even at 0.5%, I hope and believe will continue to be important. So we do have assets. I think quite a lot of our focus will shift to the Indo-Pacific. I mean, the Indian government, for example, faced with hostility with China, are looking more towards the UK than they've done in the past. We're developing a closer relationship with Japan. I mean, we haven't yet seen the product of the review of foreign policy and defence that the government are conducting. I think it's been delayed because of the spending review. But I mean, on defence, I mean, we're living in one of those eras, just as in World War I. The tank made the cavalry obsolete. I mean, now there are technological and other changes which are completely changing the face of defence. And I personally think spending 50 billion on Trident in those circumstances is a misuse of our resources. But all that has to play into our defence posture. I think we will continue to work with others, such as the French, on peacekeeping. I think, despite what's written about their difference in personality, I don't think Boris Johnson and Joe Biden will have difficulty in finding common ground on policy. Climate change being an obvious example.
And for the EU itself, I mean, it has been a rocky period for the EU, and we've seen in the past week or two Poland and Hungary asserting their muscle. In the book, you are not wildly optimistic about the future of the EU either.
Well, I think the EU has problems because of its size and the disparate nature of the membership. I do believe it will survive. I mean, the problem is that, it seems to me, is that there are some countries who still, a small group of countries who have core interests together, but actually the core of the EU now has to be the Eurozone. You can't escape from that, which is 19 countries. Now, I think they will move, but it will be slow and painful, as we've seen. I think they will move towards fiscal union over time, but I think this is going to be problematic. What happens with Hungary and Poland remains to be seen. I mean, we're assuming those things are kind of semi-permanent, but what we see in Poland in particular is actually, it seems to me, a classic case where the young urban population is rebelling against the older and rural population, against the power of the Catholic Church, etc. So this is a country which is in flux, and I don't think it's therefore condemned to be out with the norms of the EU indefinitely.
Okay, we'll go to questions now, and there are loads coming in, so thank you. And just keep using the chat thing. Probably the most common question, which has come from Kate Perez, and also from Paul Ratcliffe, and also from a couple of other people who I'll pick out a bit later on, is how soon can we rejoin, if at all?
I think that I think our politics would have to change pretty radically for that to happen. Not least because, of course, we did have various opt-outs, including from the single currency. Whereas if we were to apply again and accepted, we'd have to accept all the existing conditions of membership, including the single currency. I think in the meantime, anyway, and partly as a result of Brexit, we're going to be pretty preoccupied with the future of our own country and the future of our own United Kingdom as to whether it does remain united. I mean, the Scot Nats very reasonably point out that one of the arguments that was advanced in the independence referendum was that the only way for Scotland to stay in the European Union was to stay part of the Union with the United Kingdom. Now, the only way for the Scots to stay in the European Union is to leave the United Kingdom. And that's a huge, huge issue. And if ever identity politics was dictating something which in terms of the future of our nation is absolutely critical, this is it.
Two of the other people asking that question about rejoining were Alan Brame and Andrew Miskin. Two questions from John Ryan and David Rowley Jones, which are both again on a common topic, which is John says, to what extent do you think that the nationals of other EU member countries, old and new, have reservations about the extent and pace of the development of a closer union between them? And David also says, of the countries now in the EU, what proportion do wholeheartedly accept an ever closer union?
Well, I think I think the underlying thought behind the question is right. I mean, to me, the prime example of that is the Netherlands. I mean, the Netherlands were in the early 1990s the poster boy for full European Union. Now, very much not. And I think that one of the problems for the European Union is that motor is definitely weaker than it was. And we had, we had the treaty that gave rise to the Single European Act, and we had the Maastricht Treaty that created the single currency. And then we had a succession of treaties, the Amsterdam Treaty, the Nice Treaty, the Constitutional Treaty, which was vetoed in referendums in France and the Netherlands, and the Lisbon Treaty, which to most people were completely opaque and largely irrelevant. And so I think that, you know, from the perspective of electorates, kind of delivery is the most important thing. Nonetheless, what's at the core of the European Union, which is that inherent sharing of sovereignty, that you have policies in common, remains true. Now, the extent of those policies, obviously, is a matter for debate, and probably will go a lot more slowly than was originally envisaged, not least because in a single currency, that confronts you very directly with the things which are most important in national politics.
Straight question from Robert Latham. On the Brexit negotiations, how do you mark the negotiating skills of each side?
Well, I think the European Union held most of the cards. I think the problem was, where you can't get there from here. I mean, David Frost, Lord Frost, he along with me contributed to a booklet before the referendum published by Portland about what would happen after. And David's argument then was that the best, certainly initial policy for Britain, if we were outside the EU, would be to go for a Norway type arrangement. And I remember saying to him, I said, David, I don't think if we vote to leave, that won't be politically tenable. And the problem is, that the politics of the situation don't point in the direction of what is most sensible. The most sensible thing would be to continue to have the closest possible relationship, which would be a Norway type relationship. But that's not on the agenda of this government.
A couple of people, including Dave Matty, asking about, do you see positives coming out of Brexit? And if so, what will they be?
Well, I think there's a lot in the papers today about the future of British agriculture. I mean, the Common Agricultural Policy was was basically devised by the French for the French, and when we joined, took 75% of the European Community budget, and Britain played a critical part in reforming that. And in its latter stages, those subsidies that gave rise to butter mountains, beef mountains, etc., went away. But nonetheless, the sort of single farm payment policy is probably not the right model for future agriculture. Whether the scheme that's outlined now will be sufficient, i.e. rewarding farmers for kind of good environmental behavior, whether that will be enough to keep a vibrant farming industry, I don't know. That's one possible way in which we might improve things. We have to take the advantages that we can find in terms of using our separate influence, but I can't immediately see other areas where Britain alone can do effective things with other countries that it couldn't have done as a member. There was nothing standing in our way of developing relations with India or whoever as members of the European Union.
A note really from Christopher Wilkinson, who also asked the question about who's likely to benefit from Brexit. But he does say clearly losers are identifiable, starting, he says, with students' access to Erasmus. And actually, I was hearing the other day that probably the loss to Selwyn from the loss of Erasmus will be about £20,000 a year, and that will be money that we won't be able to use to support students doing years abroad, or we will have to ask people to help us support that. So that is a small example of where you will get a tangible and really quite significant loss. I mean, Stephen, presumably Erasmus is something that you have supported.
Absolutely, and I think that's an important loss. I mean, to me, one of the saddest things is, I mean, over a period of I sat in Brussels. I was a British ambassador to the European Union. The ambassadors met collectively in a committee of permanent representatives. We were the last sort of channel of negotiation before it went to ministers. We thought we were frightfully important, but actually, the real work was done in working groups by young women and men from all the European countries, people in their 20s and 30s, who actually hammered out the bases of the agreements, and they knew each other very well. And the email communications, the telephone lines were open on a constant basis. All that is now shut down, and I think at a sort of human level, as well as at a political level, and that's very sad. And at a political level, it's very damaging. Now, if we want to be heard, we have to knock on the door and ask to be admitted. We have no access as of right. None of the means of leaving. We have no member of the European Commission. We have no ministers sitting in the Council. We have no members of the European Parliament. We're not in any of those working groups, etc., etc. All that is massively stupid, in my view, in terms of the not some airy-fairy idealism, but the pursuit of hard national interests. I mean, a friend of mine who spent all his career in the European Union said to me, I don't agree with what he said, but I see what he meant. He said, it's a shitty organization, but it's too important not to be part of. And even at that level, we should still be part of it.
Yeah, there are a couple of people asking questions about the referendum, and obviously you were, your Selwyn involvement was as an engaged amateur, if you like. You weren't running a campaign. But Caroline Maddox says, was the 2016 referendum result the price we paid for allowing Poland and other accession states immediate freedom of movement when they joined in 2004? And if I can find it, it's a little way up. But also from Trevor Phillips, who says, in retrospect, should we, the Remain campaign, have taken a different position on immigration, i.e. rather than dodging it, deal with the issue head on, whether positively or negatively?
I think the campaign was certainly kind of blindsided by once immigration became the kind of primary issue. And I remember having a conversation with Ed Llewellyn, who was working for David Cameron at the time, and they were obviously very discombobulated by that. Yeah, I mean, I was an advisor to Tony Blair when the decision was taken. And I think we and the Swedes and the Irish, if I remember rightly, were the only countries which allowed full access to after the accession of 2004. And I remember having a conversation with my German opposite number saying, look, you guys have been champions of enlargement. Why aren't you doing it? And he said, because our demographic shows that we don't need their labor until 2011. And that's when we'll kind of let them in. So I think we certainly underestimated the size of that enlargement. And although I think in overall economic terms it was beneficial, there obviously were serious pinch points and points of perception. The other thing I think that happened, of course, is that the referendum more or less coincided with the mass refugee migration into the rest of Europe. And Nigel Farage and others, cleverly and very irresponsibly, managed to kind of conflate the two, so that the impression was given that continued membership of the European Union would be leading to that kind of mass migration. Similar untruth was told about Turkish accession. Turkey cannot accede to the European Union without the unanimous agreement of all the member states, including the UK. So, I mean, I think certainly the Remain campaign was caught on the back foot. Whether addressing the issue up front would have tackled it better, I don't know.
Stephen, when you did do the debate in Selwyn Chapel, you may remember there was a student on the opposition side, a Leave supporter, who was Josh Marr, who was at the time the president of the MCR. And he says, I won't comment on his current stage, he says, thank you for a good and balanced talk. But he wants to know, what do you think about the COVID bailout funds raised by the ECB, granting them powers for the first time in their history to generate their own funds? And what about the German court and the German polity? They're backwards and forwards about whether this is legal and the right way of taking the EU forward.
Well, I think, I mean, my own view is that the European Union, because of the single currency, has to move towards fiscal harmonization, a single fiscal policy over time, and probably a single European Central Bank to go with it. I mean, the Germans have been backwards and forwards on this issue, not just now, but over several times in their membership. And I think there are real constitutional issues. So far, it seems to me, Josh is probably much more knowledgeable than I am on this, as on most other things, but it seems to me that in the end, the Constitutional Court has taken the view that it regards as politic, as opposed to the view that it might necessarily regard as constitutionally pure.
Two questions building on what you were saying about Britain's continuing influence at the UN or NATO and so on. So, Jeremy Llewellyn, on the human level, how should British institutions, educational and cultural, now aim to set up satellite organisations on the European mainland? And some more geopolitics from Alva Hoborn. What about other global associations we're still part of? NATO, World Health Organization. How can we maintain an influence there?
Well, I think, I mean, this is, I mean, on the, I mean, I don't know what the right course is for universities, whether we can still have the attractive power that we have enjoyed up till now. I mean, I mean, and obviously this is a particularly difficult moment of transition, but I mean, I do think, you know, if you don't need me to tell you, if you look at, you know, the top 20 ranking universities in the world, there are more Americans than anybody else, but otherwise, you know, the Brits are right up there. Oxford and Cambridge and UCL and Imperial and King's and LSE, and I think those will continue to have big drawing power for obvious reasons. Sorry, what was the second part of the question, Roger? The
second part of the question was the more geopolitical one about maintaining our role in NATO, WHO. So
one of the things that the Foreign Affairs Committee rightly say is that this, you know, Britain has always been committed to the UN system and to international cooperation through organisations like the World Health Organization, etc., and that they believe that we do have considerable convening power. One of the things attached to the committee's report was a survey done by the British Council in about 48 countries, which show, okay, now these are people who know the British Council and therefore might be prejudiced in our favour, but nonetheless do believe that Britain still stands for things which are important. And China comes out by far and away the country that these other countries are most engaged with and happy to be engaged with. But some way down from there comes the United States, and only a little bit behind the United States, the United Kingdom. So we still do have those assets. And I think the government, I mean, I think the government do realize that those are assets that we have to try to build on. Obviously, our resources post-COVID are going to be more limited, but there is an attempt, I mean, to rebuild the strength of the British diplomatic service, where there were cuts over the years. It remains to be seen how the merger with DFID plays out, and it's obviously controversial. But part of it, if it can be worked, is to have a kind of coherent foreign policy approach in which you use all the tools. I mean, the Commonwealth is kind of a rather maligned organisation, but nonetheless, it is remarkable that after all the iniquities of imperialism, the countries that we conquered do still want to be part of an organisation with us, and that at least two countries, Mozambique and Rwanda, who were never part of the British Empire, have decided to join. And that the British government does exercise through its engagement with the Commonwealth considerable leverage in terms of human rights. I happen to chair an LGBT charity that benefits from that, campaigning for the LGBT rights of citizens in Commonwealth countries. So I think that, I mean, this is why it seems to me that the sort of comparisons between Boris Johnson and Trump are misplaced. Apart from anything else, whatever else is wrong with Boris Johnson, he isn't deranged. It does seem to me that our government does in that sense have interests which represent continuity between our past and our present.
That's a good moment. A diplomat calls the American president deranged. So people are putting questions, obviously, based on what you've been saying. One of them, if fiscal union is inevitable, as you said, how on earth could we have stayed in?
Well, that's a very good question, and that, in a sense, that was at the heart of the whole Cameron negotiation, of course, is to remove us as far as possible from that. Well, indeed, it was at the heart of the Maastricht Treaty, the opt-out which John Major secured back in 1991. And look, I mean, I didn't see it at the time, but I think looking back, that was actually the beginning of the divergence, really, that eventually took us out of the EU, because that did become, single currency obviously became the core existential policy, really, of the rest of the European Union. So I think that yeah, that was a critical moment.
And Andy Jones says, how do you view the impact of the euro in destroying the economies of Southern Europe?
Well, part of the problem of the euro, of course, was the way in which it was implemented in terms of the Maastricht Treaty. I mean, one of Margaret Thatcher's arguments at the time was a single currency can only work if there are fiscal transfers from the rich countries to the poor countries. And that can only happen inside a political union. And for her, that political union wasn't acceptable. Now, the Maastricht Treaty turned its face against fiscal transfers. So, of course, if you take away the right to set your own interest rates and exchange rates, then unless the rich are prepared to help the poor, you get exactly the effect that happened. I mean, I think this is why it's been so painful and almost at one stage catastrophic. But I think the Eurozone is beginning has now learnt some of those lessons, which is why I think it will move over time much more towards a real fiscal union.
And Jörg Haustein, one of our fellows who is himself German, what role do you think the EU's economic imbalance has played in all this, especially with Germany's export surplus giving rise to inequality and resentment?
Yeah, well, I think a big part, and I think that there was a lot of criticism in other parts of the European Union about German policy, and I think Germany was slow and reactive at a time when more could have been done. Absolutely, I agree with that.
Timothy Jackson asking a question about Scotland, and other people have raised Scotland too. In particular, this question of how can you want to be in one union, the EU, but not in another union, the UK? And Timothy Jackson says, do you believe the EU would offer membership to an independent Scotland should that come to pass? And might it make it clear that EU membership would be available to Scotland before the Scots vote on independence?
I doubt whether they'd do the latter, because you have to apply, and the process is that the European Commission then make a report. I mean, there would be political indications. I mean, the attitude of the Spanish is obviously critical because of Catalonia, and there have been rather ambivalent statements from Spain in the past. But Scotland would certainly have the right to apply, and in terms of the economic and political criteria, it would meet the criteria for membership. So I think over time it would be difficult to refuse. I mean, this seems to me to be a classic case where at the moment, our government in Westminster is allowing identity politics in Scotland to absolutely dominate the argument. We should be having a proper constitutional debate about what should the constitution be in a federal country such as ours. What, for example, should be the role of a second chamber? Instead of having a ridiculous unelected chamber, the House of Lords, larger than any other unelected parliament apart from the Chinese, we should be having a second chamber, maybe like the Bundesrat in Germany, in which the component parts of the United Kingdom have a real legislative role. So I mean, if I had anything to do with this, I would be organising a constitutional convention. That might be that the Scots Nats would hate it. They might not even take part. But you could have, for say, a period of 2 years, a proper discussion, which would enable you to think about the real implications of Scottish independence, including for the security of the British Isles as a whole, which otherwise will get lost in all the chaff of simply the identity issue.
Related, Nick Rugg is saying, could Brexit lead to both an independent Scotland and a united Ireland? And a couple of other people have said, why wasn't the Good Friday Agreement part of the 2016 referendum campaign?
I mean, I think the answer to the first question is undoubtedly it could. I'm not saying it will, but it certainly could. Well, people did attempt to make the case about Ireland and the impact of Ireland. But again, I think it comes back to this issue of how difficult it was to get resonance really on the issues, as opposed to this more question of basic identity.
Okay, we're coming towards the end of the time, so do by all means fire in a last couple of questions. But I want to ask a couple of things about you, Stephen, if I may. So first of all, working at such close quarters with John Major and Tony Blair, and as you say in the book, you have been really pretty much in the Foreign Office or in other areas working with the most senior politicians of the last 30 or 40 years. Who impressed you most?
That's a difficult. Well, over the course of my career, the politician who was the most exciting, dynamic, original thinker that I worked for was David Owen, the Labour Foreign Secretary under Jim Callaghan. A very, very remarkable guy. Of the prime ministers, I worked for Jim Callaghan in the press office. Jim Callaghan was a rough and tough politician. John Major, much underestimated, I think, not least because he was thought to be very grey, whereas in fact, I never quite understood why he couldn't convey this in public. But just give you a quick example. When I was in Brussels, he was no longer Prime Minister. He came to Brussels to launch his autobiography, and he began his speech at the thing saying, "When I was researching my autobiography, I discovered that I could trace my ancestry all the way back to my father, Paul, which is more than could be said for several members of my cabinet." He went on in this vein, and that was very typical of him. I think that his record in government was good. Tony Blair was much more obviously charismatic. For me, if you're, saying I work with all these guys makes me sound rather self-important. I worked for them, and if you work for the great ones, as Douglas Hurd used to call them, it's very important that they're nice people. And both John Major and Tony Blair were nice people. They were easy to work for. You didn't feel nervous going into a meeting to express your view. You weren't going to be, shouted down or whatever. And I think that, in domestic terms, both did a pretty good job for our country.
And there are some lovely pen portraits in the book as well about, Giscard d'Estaing sounds pretty grisly, and Chirac, by comparison, rather sort of more warm and with human touch. So I would recommend all those pen portraits in the book as well. Stephen, about you as well, when you did do the referendum debate in 2016, I remember you saying that you had previously been in chapel, most recently in 2008, when you were at that point a heterosexually married Catholic, and you were standing in chapel in 2016 as a gay atheist. Just tell us what happened.
This is true. Well, as far as the Catholic bit was concerned, at the time I preached that sermon, and Owen Chadwick, who had been master of Selwyn when I was there, a great man, was still there and was present. I mean, if ever a book is published of memorable sermons preached in Selwyn Chapel, mine will definitely not be among them, because I was trying very hard to kind of hedge my bets. And at the time, I was wrestling with my sexuality. It's something that I've been doing for most of my adult life before I came out about 11 years ago. And I mean, it's an interesting reflection on the times that when I was in Selwyn, somebody a year or two ahead of me attempted suicide because he was a young gay man. and coming to terms with that was very difficult. And at the time, Bob Hardy, who was the Anglican assistant chaplain, went on to become a distinguished Anglican bishop. Bob Hardy provided the kind of pastoral support for that guy that was very, very, very important to his recovery. And that's, seems to me, one of the reasons why the kind of college system and perhaps Selwyn in particular has so much to commend it.
Well, we're very fond of you and of your husband, Ted, so best wishes to you both. Just on the Catholicism, how did the atheism happen?
Well, basically, I blame Richard Dawkins. I mean, I think that there's a lot of comfort in being able to believe. And I read Richard Dawkins' book, and I had worked for a year for Cardinal Cormac Murphy O'Connor, the senior Catholic Archbishop of Cardinal, very, very lovely guy. But reading Richard Dawkins confronted me with certain things that I hadn't really wanted to confront. And I had to conclude that actually, did I believe that there was a divine being and an afterlife? And the answer was that I didn't. I did no longer believe that. And it's hard enough to be a Catholic if you do believe. It's certainly difficult to be a Catholic, bums on seats, as it were, if you stopped believing. I forget who it was who said, God is dead, but oh how I miss him. And I feel a bit like that. I still think of myself as a Christian who doesn't believe in God, which I know is a sort of contradiction in terms, but you know what I'm getting at. There are certain things in the Gospels which seem to me to be good guides to life, whether you believe in divinity or not.
Well, Stephen, thank you for an incredibly interesting talk tonight. There does sound to be a book actually in your own experiences as well as in the story that you tell in Reluctant European. And we're just incredibly grateful, and thank you very much indeed for your insights. And I know I always say on these occasions that we would be able to hear applause ringing out if everyone were fully in a room with us. But I also just want to underline that we remain incredibly appreciative of all the people who join us for these events, our current students, our alumni and everyone. And we are determined that the online events will continue through 2021 and beyond. So we very much want to have you back and people here with us, but we also will make sure there are plenty of online events as well. And I'll read some of the comments coming in, Stephen. So Martin Colston, fascinating talk. Looking forward to whatever talks come next. Alva Holborn, great. Ian Folder, thank you, Stephen, very useful insights. David Carter, clap, 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 excellent talk. Andrew Malone, fascinating conversation, thank you so much. Mary Blackman, also thank you so much. Alan Sirop, applause indeed. Kenneth Wilson, thank you. And Susanna Landry Perslow, excellent talk. So I think people are.
Well, thank you everybody for participating, and thank you, Roger, for the invitation. It's I've enjoyed it.
Okay, well, thanks everyone, and we have some ghost stories coming up between now and Christmas, so you may want to join us for those, and some other great talks coming up in the new year, including John Morrill on history. So please keep an eye out on Facebook and the website. And until then, thank you again for joining us tonight, and we'll both say goodbye. So bye, everybody.
Bye. Thanks a lot.